All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum. This is a podcast where we look at the intersection of autism and Christianity, specifically looking at Autism 1 or ASD 1. And we ask various questions about what are these different communities and subcommunities of autistic Christians and ex-Christians actually like, using a data-driven research approach. I've collected data from well over 26,000 autistic Christians and ex-Christians. I have done interviews with more than 500, and I have put out countless surveys to asking them questions about what they think and why they think it. And this podcast exists to sort of explain that research. And as part of that, I've been investigating various questions like, why are so many autistics Lutheran? And why are so many autistics Catholic? And today we're going to be asking, why are so many autistics Anglican? And do a deeper dive into what Anglicanism is and why autistic people are so interested in it. And to help me with that, I have brought on a non-autistic, but very qualified Anglican priest, Ben Crosby. Why don't you start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, thanks so much, John. Wonderful to be here. Yes, my name's Ben Crosby. I am a priest of the Episcopal Church, currently serving in the Anglican Church of Canada, and I'm also a PhD student in church history, where I work on the English Reformation.
And for those of you who are longtime listeners of this podcast, you may recognize him from the episode we did about MAID, or Medical Assistance in Dying. So if you'd like to hear more from Ben, that is the place to find it on this podcast. He also has a great Substack that I would recommend everyone check out, especially if they're interested in Anglicanism. And he also has writings on a bunch of other places like Plow and I think Earth and Altar as well. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, that's
yeah,
right.
you can find him on all sorts of places. Yeah, so the question I often get is, what is the most popular autistic denomination for autistic Christians? And the answer to that is confessional Lutherans by percentage. However, in North America, at least by percentage, it's the confessional Lutherans. But by head count, it's Anglicans.
All
Now,
right.
yeah, so there are caveats with this. So one of the biggest caveats is all of my data is on the English-speaking world, and England has a lot of English speakers in it. You may be surprised to learn. And yeah, and England has a state church, and that state church is the Church of England, which is Anglican. And so there are a lot of autistic people in my data set who I pick up in England who are sort of Anglican by default, or Anglican because that's sort of the de facto state religion in that region. And so that is the reason why they are highest by head count. But even if you took out all of England and you factored in only North America, you would still have a very large number of Anglicans. Anglicans would make up still the highest head count of all the denominations that I have been able to find, not by a very significant margin, but by quite a bit. That being said, are you familiar with tier rankings? Do you know what I mean by like S tier, A tier,
know.
B tier? Okay.
Oh, yeah. No, sorry,
Yeah.
I got you. Yes.
So in terms of like ranking Anglicanism for where you think it lands in autistic Christian compatibility, what tier would you aim to put it in?
I'm thinking A. Maybe not S, but A.
Yeah, so I would agree. I think it's strong A, weak S, somewhere in that. It's not always going to work, but it works for an awful large number of us. And yeah, so highest by head count in my data set. And also, I get asked this a lot. What is the highest head count by like average Sunday attendance? So there's head count by association, but then there's head count by like, okay, so you call yourself Anglican, but you maybe participate by going to church once a month or once every 6 months, or like Christmas and Easter. What about the people who are really hard in the paint for it? And so Average Sunday attendance is difficult when you're thinking about autistic populations because a lot of autistic people have sensory issues and other sort of social issues and social mitigating factors that make it difficult for them to attend church. And so I don't use average Sunday attendance or like regular Sunday attendance for this metric. What I use is basically how frequently do you use and participate in the various forms of worship and practice associated with Anglicanism, and or associated with Catholicism, or associated with Lutheranism or evangelicalism and things like that. And the highest number again is Anglicans. Highest percentage is still confessional Lutherans by relative percent, but highest by numbers in that case, by just pure head count, is the Anglicans. So there are many autistic people who are not just Anglican, but quite enthusiastic about being Anglican. And if you are online and in any online Anglican spaces, you've probably met them. So this is the general overview of the numbers, and this is generally speaking where things tend to be. Another really fun fact about Anglicanism is the most migrated to or converted to Christian tradition for autistics. So if you look at adult converts, or if you look at people who are denomination hopping, the denomination that they will typically stop hopping at is Anglicanism, or the denomination that they will convert to in adulthood is Anglicanism. So that it is the largest funnel for converts.
So
for autistic adult converts, I should say. So which leads to some pretty interesting stats that we'll talk about later on in the episode. But before we get into that, I think it's best to start out by asking, what is Anglicanism? Because there are many opinions that you will hear about what Anglicanism is and what Anglicanism isn't. One thing that I hear a lot is that Anglicanism is the via media, the road between Rome and Luther, and yeah, I know you love that analogy and have no issues with it.
No, it's brilliant, perfect. We can just end it here. That's all you need to know. Yes,
that's all you need to know about Anglicanism. Okay, so anyway, moving on to the next topic. No, let's go back to that. So what is Anglicanism?
Yeah, so I think before I answer that, I think it's probably worth saying that I'm kind of wearing, I guess, a couple of hats when I answer this, right? That I'm both a historian of the English Reformation on one hand, and I'm also a priest, right? And so I want to try to be somewhat careful about when I'm making kind of descriptive historical versus kind of normative claims of like what I think Anglicanism should be. Like the two bleed together to some degree, but I think it's just worth noting that at the outset. I think the simplest way, although as you suggest, a not uncontested way to answer the question, is that Anglicanism is the variety of Protestant Christianity that emerges from the English Reformation and then essentially gets taken worldwide with English colonial ventures around the world. So it's a form of Protestant Christianity, specifically, at least at its outset, quite solidly within the Reformed Protestant world, so closer to Geneva and to Zurich, to Calvin and Zwingli than to Luther, although also from the beginning a little bit odd amongst the Reformed world in its fairly strong emphasis on liturgy, as well as its so the Book of Common Prayer is the Anglican liturgical text, as well as its ordering by bishops. And as it develops sort of through the centuries, I think what counts as Anglicanism, or where the sort of center of gravity lies, does shift in a direction that is perhaps closer to this idea of the via media, sort of between other Protestants and Rome, but that is a 19th and 20th century development in the tradition. So I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, that's good. So maybe it's also good to start with another question sort of related to that is, what was the English Reformation?
Yes. So the English Reformation is something that happens really over the 16th century, in which the church in England becomes the Church of England, as it were, that the church no longer looks to accept papal authority, looks to Rome. This happens, as is fairly well known, initially with Henry VIII and his desire to secure an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, which gets denied by the papacy largely because Catherine of Aragon is closely related to the Holy Roman Emperor, and the troops of the Holy Roman Empire had occupied Rome and the Vatican in the 15 yeah in sort of in the period when this is all happening in the 1530s. So there's this initial break that happens under Henry that gets intensified under Edward. There's a return to Catholicism under Mary. And then under Elizabeth, there's a sort of restoration of approximately the church situation under Edward, which then, somewhat by accident, ends up more or less persisting into, for a long time there to come. Now, the story that I just told makes it sound very political and perhaps not terribly theologically motivated. And I think that's a little bit of a mistake or misperception. I mean, Henry's own beliefs are sort of difficult to suss out in some cases, but for him to make this break that he wanted happen, his sort of the only allies, or the most important allies, I should say, that he could find to do that were committed Protestants in England, who were sort of originally quite strongly persecuted, but they were, some exceptions, but they were sort of the most significant party that was, willing to entertain the idea of this break with Rome. And so you have the sort of dynastic and political reasons coming together with a commitment to these new theological currents coming out of Germany and Switzerland that come together to create the English Reformation.
Cool. Yeah, and out of that, or sort of a little bit after, I don't know, I get my timelines mixed up on this, so please correct me. The 39 articles were created, and the 39 articles are, I would say, they're fairly important to Anglicanism. Opinions may differ on that. However, at one point they were very significant to Anglicanism, so can you explain what the 39 articles are?
That's right. So they are basically the Anglican, the historic Anglican confessional statement, sort of statement of belief. So it's a set of a doctrinal position that's put together in the reign of Elizabeth I. So drawn up in 1563, finally fully sort of approved in 1571, would function really until the middle of the 20th century as the pretty clear sort of statement of Anglican beliefs. So clergy would have to subscribe to them, have to say, yes, hold and will teach according to these beliefs. They would be, read when clergy would take on new positions. They'd have to read them and tell the congregation assembled that this is what they were going to teach according to. As far as what's in them, I think the easiest way to describe them is a sort of ironic or broad Reformed Protestant statement of belief. So it's going to hold forth the doctrine. It's going to hold up the creeds, the kind of basic Catholic or Chalcedonian Catholic consensus of Apostles, Nicene. I guess Athanasian is really just in the West. But anyway, these sort of classic creeds of the Western Christian Church, going to hold to Protestant positions on Scripture and on salvation. I'm going to say that salvation is something that God works entirely by God's agency, not something that we sort of earn or even really cooperate in, although we then respond to the free gift of salvation with good works. On the sacraments, and this is actually a surprise to a lot of Anglicans today, it does really take the Reformed rather than Lutheran line. It denies a sort of corporal presence of Christ in, say, the Eucharistic elements, but it says in a very strong way that, in eating the bread and wine, there is still a participation in Christ's body and blood. So it's, I think, about as high a sort of sacramental teaching you can have and still be within kind of the Reformed ambit, if that makes sense. What it doesn't have is a lot of details about the nuances of double predestination, or these sort of questions about the extent of the atonement, or the resistibility of grace, because these are things that become real markers of Reformed identity or real sources of conflict later in the 16th century. So they have, I think, the good fortune to be written at this time before, perhaps, at least in my view, before the Reformed tradition turned to demanding a lot of doctrinal specificity on these fairly abstract questions of the mechanics of salvation. So broad Reformed Protestant statement of faith functioned as the English Confession or the Anglican Confession, along with some other important documents like the Book of Common Prayer and the Ordinal, which is the rite that's used for ordaining clergy in the Anglican Church, and in a sort of subsidiary role of the two books of homilies, which are these two sort of official sermons books that were put out in the 16th century.
Yeah, so can you maybe talk a little bit about the Book of Common Prayer that you just mentioned?
Absolutely. So this is one of the most important and I think most distinctive things about Anglicanism, both originally and as it develops, is the emphasis that it puts on its liturgy. So this is starting in 1549, and then revised in 1552, and then lightly revised thereafter until it achieves its final form in England anyway in 1662. This is the worship book of the Church of England. And so all of these services authorized for worship in the church are contained in this book. Most importantly, the service of Holy Communion and morning and evening prayer, or what's often called the daily office. So one thing that is quite distinct, at least among Reformed churches, I guess in this way there's perhaps some closer to early Lutheranism, but the Book of Common Prayer wasn't a total throwing out of the kind of previous inherited liturgical traditions. It was rather a reworking of them in a Protestant key. So taking these existing materials and sort of transforming them to speak the theology of the 16th century Church of England. The 1662 that I mentioned remained the authorized liturgy of the Church of England, and more or less dominant across global Anglicanism or derivatives thereof, until once again the second half of the 20th century, where there was a big wave of liturgical renewal that transformed a lot of how Anglican worship looks. But I think in a lot of ways, even now, it remains quite influential for how Anglicans of all stripes worship.
It remains the official Book of Common Prayer for in my heart, at least.
Amen.
So,
Yes, absolutely.
yeah, so this is probably a good point to ask the question: how is Anglicanism different from other forms of Protestantism?
Yes. So I think historically, from the beginning, this sort of very strong emphasis on liturgy and on, I mean, this was the only text you were allowed to use. This was the law enforced by the state. This very strong sense of
Return.
importance on liturgy is already pretty unique. Governance by bishops is also not wholly unique, but somewhat unusual, especially among Reformed churches. There are a few others that did maintain bishops, but that, from the beginning was looked at as unique. And as the history of Anglicanism developed, these distinctives, the sort of liturgical focus, the governance by bishops, that were often actually in their original context just seen as, these kind of nice or fine things, but maybe not so important, also became to be seen as increasingly important. And so the argument was not just, we have bishops and it's fine to have bishops, as well as to order your church a bunch of other ways, but an increasing number of Anglicanisms came to argue that, ordering your church via bishops was the right way to order the church. And so I think the simplest way to put it is that the unusual features of Anglicanism, and unusual features which often made Anglicanism look a little bit more like Roman Catholicism, came over the centuries to be seen as increasingly important and constitutive of Anglican identity, at least among many, although not all, Anglicans.
Yep, that makes sense. So within Anglicanism, at least modern Anglicanism, there are a lot of different types of Anglicans, right? So you have
Yes.
Anglo-Catholics, you have extremely low church Anglicans, you have high church Anglicans that aren't Anglo-Catholic, and you have charismatic Anglicans and everything in between. So could you just sort of talk about how that even came to be?
Absolutely. And I think it's worth saying, I mean, this is something that Anglicans, you know, like to talk about. I think sometimes we underestimate how much internal diversity there also is in other forms of Christianity as well. So I don't want to suggest this is just an Anglican thing. But basically, going back already to the easily the early 17th century, you start to see a gap between, what typically gets called low and high church Anglicanism, with low church Anglicans quite often being pretty hardline Calvinist and really emphasizing preaching. High church Anglicans tending to be still Protestant, but not so committed necessarily to some of these sort of really hardline kind of Calvinist or sort of post Calvin developments in the Reformed tradition, and also tending to put a lot more emphasis on things like liturgy, on things like sacraments, on the sort of ordered ritual of the church. There's then civil war, in which very briefly the Church of England, as ordered by bishops and using the prayer book, is overthrown and replaced with a Presbyterian polity. The civil war ends. The prayer book, bishops are brought back, and you again have a sort of long-standing high church, low church divide. You then have, in the 19th century, is when what you just mentioned, something called anglo-catholicism develops. And this is really where this idea that we mentioned earlier, the via media, comes from. Sort of these are the guys that come up with the set of, yes, Christians in the Church of England who thought that what the Church of England needed, what the Church of England was, what Anglicanism was, this sort of non-papal Catholicism, or this middle way between the excesses of Rome on one hand and then sort of Protestants on the other. And it's really in this period that a lot of the things that are now pretty common and unremarkable in Anglican worship, things like candles on the altar, things like calling it an altar rather than a table, more sort of colorful vestments for clergy, where those sort of start to enter in to Anglican practice. And then, significantly later, now really the middle of the 20th century, you do have in the Anglican Church, as well as in a number of other churches, this moment of a sort of charismatic renewal, revival, people sort of experiencing, they narrate as this kind of dramatic experiences of the Holy Spirit, often characterized by speaking in tongues. And so you have Anglicans that do that too. And so now, yes, there's a broad spectrum. There's, you can find people, and this is sort of where I, for what it's worth, would situate myself as a kind of more sort of old school evangelical Anglican who really likes the old prayer book and the articles in a more formal worship, but is also very Protestant theologically. You have varieties of high church Anglicans who, may range theologically from more Reformed to more Lutheran. You have Anglo-Catholics who in some cases are closer to pre-Tridentine Roman Catholicism than your average Roman Catholic today. You have sort of more modern evangelicals and charismatics whose services will look almost indistinguishable from sort of non-denominational kind of praise bands and sermon styles. So there is a broad spectrum, a broad world.
Yes, and sometimes you have Reformed Anglicans who have a lot of sympathies with Lutherans attending an Anglo-Catholic church because the Anglican Church of Canada has been very lax on the maid issue, and the only ones who are taking it seriously are the Anglo-Catholics.
Yep.
That's some John lore right there for anyone who wanted to know.
Speaking from personal
Yeah.
experience there,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, yeah. I'm not very Anglo-Catholic, but I do attend an Anglo-Catholic church, one of the Protestant holdouts, reforming the Anglo-Catholics.
Woo!
We'll get them one day. No. Yeah, so that's sort of, I think, a broader overview of the development of Anglicanism, but I think it's also important to talk about what Anglicanism actually looks like nowadays.
Yes.
Like what most people will actually encounter when they come to Anglicanism. So I think it's probably good to start by talking about the theological makeup of modern Anglicanism, like where it tends to fall on that spectrum between conservative to liberal. I know it's not a like nothing is ever simple on a single spectrum, but can you sort of explain where the modern Anglican Church tends to land theologically?
Absolutely. And I think it's worth saying at this point that I'm going to speak here primarily about the sort of larger and more mainline Anglican churches in North America, for example, or the Church of England. I think, as I think we're going to talk about, there has been in the last couple of decades a pretty substantial split within North American Anglicanism over sexuality questions, which has produced sort of multiple churches with that look quite different. But so kind of mainline Anglicanism, the Episcopal Church in the United States, the Anglican Church of Canada in Canada, the Church of England is, I think, on paper, very much little o orthodox, if you will, committed to the creeds, committed to the kind of basic tenets of of Christian theology, the Trinity, the Incarnation, crucifixion, resurrection, return in glory, so on and so forth. I think, and this is one of the things that I will admit I often find quite frustrating about Anglicanism, is that in a lot of these churches, whether or not the beliefs of the clergy and parishioners of a given congregation aligns with the kind of stated official doctrine of the church can be a bit touch and go, shall we say. I mean, you
Yes.
can you can find places that are, yes, resolutely creedal. You can find places that are like very conservative, sort of theologically, socially, politically, etc. You can also find a lot of places that are quite theologically liberal, and I mean that to be clear, sort of not in the sense of like social or political positions, but in the sense of, let's say, do you think the resurrection really happened? Was the tomb actually empty on Easter morning, or is this a metaphor for how good comes out of evil, or sort of something like that? I think in a lot of ways, actually, at least in my experience, maybe this is wish casting on my part, I'm not sure, but I think a lot of these churches had a lot more of that sort of theological liberalism, which I, cards on the table, don't think very highly of a couple decades ago than it does now, but it's definitely still there, and it's around.
Yep, I'll just share some experiences I've had in the Anglican Church of Canada, which I have been participating in to some extent for probably 10, 11 years. Most of it as an atheist. So, as an atheist, I showed up to church and they were like, "You should take communion." And I said, "I'm an atheist. I don't think I should." And they said, "Oh, that doesn't matter." Um,
Oh, no.
and I said, "I actually think it does. So I'm not going to do that." So you have instances like that.
Yep.
I on Trinity Sunday, I've heard a homily preached about how the Trinity isn't actually that important.
Oh,
On
no.
on Christmas Eve, I heard another sermon about how the virgin birth is not an essential doctrine and that we should jettison it and go to more modern ways of knowing, because of course we know that virgins can't conceive without sexual reproduction. And then on Transfiguration Sunday, the same priest gave a homily about how the Transfiguration was similar to the teen romance novel Twilight, in which Edward sparkled in the sun.
Not the sparkles. No.
Yeah, and how the author, who is a Christian, she's a Mormon, but in the homily they said this author who's a Christian was inspired by the Transfiguration, and also decided to let all of us know that she was Team Edward. Uh, anyway, so you have that, but then also in the church that I currently attend, the homily that I first encountered on Corpus Christi, which was the first day I happened to attend this Anglo-Catholic church, was about how maid was bad and abortion was murder. So there was a full gambit of
Yep.
theological beliefs within the church. It tends more to be on the theological liberal side of things. So also important to talk about is the political makeup of, or actually, before we get there, I will say this is a little different in England when you compare it to
Yes.
North America. So in England, within the Church of England, there are various different factions. I'll say the evangelicals within the Church of England tend to be quite theologically conservative and tend to be very close to what North American evangelicals are like, but they are still within the Church of England and still operating under those auspices. It is far more common to find more theological diversity, I've found, in the Church of England than it is perhaps in the mainline. I don't know if that's just me going off vibes or if that's accurate.
That's definitely my perhaps also somewhat vibes-based sense as well, that you probably have around the same range, but the center of gravity is quite different, I think.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
yes,
I think that's a
more
good way to put it.
theologically
Yeah.
conservative.
Yep. So the next thing to talk about is the political makeup of Anglicanism, and I think this one, it's especially within mainline church, it's pretty progressive, pretty like liberal center progressive somewhere in there. Generally speaking, very inclusive in most cases. So I don't know. Do you want to say anything else about that?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think, to put it in Canadian terms, it's really the Liberal Party of Canada, but thinks it's the NDP in a lot of cases. Like it often thinks it's a little more, radical and edgy politically than it actually is. But certainly, I think broadly speaking, especially among the clergy, I mean, in the pews, it's a bit more of a mixed bag. But it's broadly on the left, with exceptions, but broadly on the sort of in the liberal left spectrum.
Yeah, and that often comes out in a lot of the way that the church decides to present itself and the various issues that it tends to be concerned with, and also importantly, tends to be very progressive on issues like LGBT inclusion. And in most Anglican churches, uh, gay marriage is accepted and allowed and treated as equally valid to straight marriage. This will vary from diocese to diocese and church to church, as they are allowed to hold differing opinions on these things. However, generally speaking, it is a denomination that is predominantly inclusive. Some exceptions apply, but that's generally how it is in North America. I think it's a little more complicated in the UK.
Yeah, I was about to
Yeah.
say that's definitely the case in North America. I think there's a big fight about it happening in the UK right now. But yes, so the sort of the church wide situation is quite different there, even though there are also a good number of individual congregations that are affirming, inclusive, whatever language you want to use, on LGBTQ questions.
Yes, and this brings us to the next topic, which is there was a pretty large split. Well, I don't know if large split. There was a major split, I'll say, in Anglicanism in the, was it the mid 2000s that this happened?
Yeah, like late 2000, I think we started at 0809, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. So do you just want to kind of explain what that is and how it came to be?
Yes, absolutely. Oh no, I'm sorry. I just checked. I was wrong about this. That's not right. It was early to mid 2000s. You were right. So yes. So basically, um, the split was about the inclusion of LGBTQ people in the church and about what form that could take. There had been a smaller split a little bit earlier about women's ordination, but this was a much bigger one. The kind of presenting spark, I guess, was that a diocese, the Episcopal Church, in 2003 consecrated an openly gay and partnered man as bishop. And this was, I think, for a number of conservatives in the church, the the last straw, something that they could not, in good conscience, sort of be a part of, and so they left. There were a lot of complicated and quite ugly lawsuits over whether or not whole dioceses could withdraw from the Episcopal Church or not. But when the dust sort of eventually settled, there was in the United States and also present in Canada, although the split was a little less major there, two main Anglican denominations, the sort of bigger and generally more progressive one, the Episcopal Church in the States, the Anglican Church of Canada in Canada, and then the Anglican Church in North America, which, as I say, was sort of founded, out of a out of a desire to move against what they saw as sort of liberalizing measures that were not faithful to God's word. Now, part of where things get a little complicated is that sort of since then, I think a lot of people who have found themselves in the more conservative Anglican denomination are there not as sort of people leaving more progressive forms of Christianity, but actually people leaving even more conservative forms of sort of American evangelicalism, things like that, which, yes, give the ACNA its own sort of texture and internal divisions. The basic story at its core was, is it okay to have gay marriage and to have, partnered gay clergy in leadership roles in the church? And most of the church, either said yes or said, well, we're not sure, but we can stay in communion with those who are saying yes. And a smaller group said, this is sort of a red line for us. We're going to form our own church.
Yeah, and so in Canada, I believe it's the ANIC, the Anglican Network in Canada, and they are essentially ACNA, or sometimes pronounced ACNA. I have attended some of their churches as well. They tend to be far more evangelical flavored versions of Anglicanism than suit my tastes, I'll say. But that is, I know many fine autists within both camps. Yeah, this is anything else that you think might be important for people to know about Anglicanism?
No, I think that's a
I think we covered
decent
it.
introduction, at least.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So fun stats here. So the cradle versus convert ratio is very interesting. If you had to guess, I've already said that it's the most converted to religion or most converted to version of Christianity for autistic people. Do you think that there are more cradles than converts, and what would you guess the ratio would be if you
Oh,
had to guess?
my guess is way more converts than cradles. For ratio 4-1.
That is really close.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's 5 to 1.
5-1. Okay.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Yep.
So five converts for every cradle that I've been able to find in autistics that identify as Anglican. Yeah, for every one who grew up in Anglicanism, there are 5 who converted from another tradition, which, in my opinion, is wild.
That is
uh,
wild.
I have not seen this with any other form of Christianity. Within autistic Christians, it for some reason this is just a magnet that
Hmm.
that sucks in autistic people. Most of the time, if I meet an autistic person who is an adult and an Anglican, they have not grown up in the Anglican Church and they have moved to it or converted to it. This is also probably the case because my data tends to skew quite young,
Mm.
and older autistics, those ratios would be probably very different, but they're just older people tend to not even know they're autistic, and so it's
Sure.
very hard to collect data on these people, and there's like wild underdiagnosis of people above the age of 40, and so really hard to tell. I would guess though the ratios would normalize once you start getting a bit older,
Yeah, that makes sense.
but in younger populations the ratios are heavily skewed, where a lot of autistic people move into Anglicanism. And so I've talked about this before on the podcast, but there's this tendency within autistic people called high church drift, where autistic people will tend to, as they get older, the chances that they will stay in their tradition, if they are low church, significantly it's significantly lower as they age, that they'll actually stay in that tradition, and they tend, if they stay Christian, to move to a high church denomination.
Interesting.
And if they are Protestant, what's the first high church denomination they think of? Anglicanism. And
Right.
they basically land in Anglicanism, or they go, oh, this seems interesting. And then there's also another secondary effect that happens. So you get autistic people who are interested in Anglicanism, so they become Anglican. And then other autistic people who are interested in Anglicanism run into these other Anglican autistics and go, oh, someone who can speak my language, someone who knows how I think, someone who can explain things on terms that I am willing to accept. And then you get another Anglican autistic. And then just that feedback loop sort of just starts cranking on and on and on, where now that this critical mass of autistic people has been established, more people who are looking to join these, looking to join a new Christian denomination, will basically find other people like them in that denomination. And autistic people tend to prefer other autistic people, and they tend to prefer talking to other autistic people. And there are many who are very enthusiastic, especially online. And that is the number one place that autistic people get their information about Christianity from. It's online, social media, YouTube, podcasts, and places like Twitter or Instagram and things like that. And the chances that you will run into an autistic Anglican on any of those platforms, quite high. And so that is basically why that effect happens. But yeah, so one of the more interesting data points is that there are a lot of Anglican autistic adult converts. If you had to guess gender ratios of autistic women to autistic men, what would you guess the ratio would be at?
Oh man, I am not. This I feel like I'm really just. I don't feel like I have good grounds for this guess, but we're gonna say 60-40 male.
60-40 male. So the actual ratio that I've been able to establish, once you control for percentages of autistic people, so autistic men are disproportionately more likely to be diagnosed than autistic women. However, if you try to take into account like the selection effects and things like that, and then normalize the data set, it would be around 2-1 women to men.
Oh,
However,
okay.
Pre-normalization, it would probably be about close to 0.8 women to 1 man in terms of that. But this, you need to account for significant underdiagnosis in women when you're making these calculations. So if you apply proper normalization to the data, the gender ratio is 2-1 for women to men. So for every, it's around 66 women to 33 men per 100 autistics. So this is for a particular reason. Can you guess what this particular reason is?
Does it have anything to do with Anglican worship?
It does not.
Well, my second guess then is I thought that might be just generally appealing. So my second guess was that it's something to do with the kind of way that Anglican churches tend to articulate justice commitments.
It is, so it's related to that. It is that Anglicans tend to have a much more egalitarian tone to their gender politics than other Christian denominations, and tend to be open to things like women's ordination and women bishops in a way that other denominations are not. And that tends to be a very big factor for autistic women, where it is not as much of a factor for autistic men. And so autistic women who, under a different set of circumstances, had they been born a man or something like that, who would probably convert to Catholicism because they were born a woman and they like Catholicism, but don't like the gender politics and the way that the gender politics of Catholicism affect them. find Anglo-Catholicism and go, yes, this
That
is
makes sense.
this is my
Yep.
place.
Mm-hmm.
um like a lot of them will express frustration, or they used to be part of the Catholic Church, but then they are barred from being a server or barred from subdeaconing or something like that. But they go to an Anglo-Catholic church, and what do you know? They get to keep all their Catholic practices, but now they can also be ordained, or if they feel a call to religious life, they can follow that call through to ordination in a way
Mm-hmm.
that really isn't possible in other denominations. Autistic women also tend to be more socially progressive. So, like you said, the church's orientation on justice issues tends to be a lot more appealing to autistic women than it is to autistic men. And those basically the two biggest reasons that I
Interesting.
find autistic women tend to emphasize more than autistic men for talking about why they want to. So your first guess is good, but the first guess is generally appealing to autistic people across gender lines. But the reason that there is a skewed gender ratio is because of the sort of allowing women to be in all stations that men are allowed to be
Mm-hmm.
in, and the gender politics around that, and then the tendency to be more socially progressive and in line with their already pre-established understandings of things. Young progressive men are also likely to convert to Anglicanism for similar reasons. However, young progressive men who are autistic tend not to convert to Christianity. So
Mm-hmm.
so that will also skew things. And if they aren't progressive, they will likely join the ACNA rather than the Episcopal Church or the Anglican Church of Canada, or they will tend to join a more conservative faction of Anglicanism within whatever Anglican church they're in. But yeah, that's generally it. But a lot of autistic men will convert to Catholicism, where where gender politics doesn't really affect them in the way that it affects women, and
Right.
so it's not really a factor in their decision making. But it tends to be a very big factor in decision making for autistic women.
That's really interesting.
We talked a bit about generally why it's appealing. You mentioned forms of worship, and that is definitely a really big one. So autistic people love the liturgy, especially more drawn to the high church traditions within Anglicanism. If you had to guess any other reasons why you think, for the most cited reasons, for why they chose the Anglican Church, so we got one with
Yeah.
the high church aesthetics and preferences.
Yeah. So another one, I don't know if this is sort of within that or is distinct enough to be its own category, but I think not only in sort of Sunday worship, but I think a pattern of day-to-day spirituality, like daily office, these morning and prayer services I mentioned that are sort of set, fixed, kind of repetitive, and not expecting, I guess, certain forms of like very expressive emotional engagement with
Yes.
God to sort of count.
Yes, so that's a really big one. So a lot of autistic people love the Book of Common Prayer and often are like, I where was this my whole life?
Mm,
Especially if they come from a low church evangelical tradition. They're like, I wish I had known about this. A lot of autistic people struggle with the sort of emotional spontaneity that's expected of them in other traditions. And within Anglicanism, you absolutely can have that. But if what you want is for someone to pre-think the words for you so that you can assent to them, and if you aren't very comfortable with verbal spontaneous prayer, the piety and the forms of piety that are available to you within Anglicanism are broad enough to fit with autistic people in a way that other traditions really don't have as much room for. So this obviously, also true of Catholicism and Orthodoxy and some Lutherans, but generally speaking, that the Book of Common Prayer is very commonly cited, and
hmm,
just being able to go to church and knowing what the words are going to be, and
yep.
knowing what the prayers are going to be, and knowing that you can sort of look it up ahead of time and know what you're assenting to or what you're not assenting to. And those types of things are very big. Another thing that gets commonly cited is doctrinal flexibility within Anglicanism. So this is both, I think, a weakness and a strength for autistic people within Anglicanism. Doctrine is the largest cited reason for cognitive dissonance within autistic people who are within Christianity. So if you were looking at things that really caused cognitive dissonance, especially if you're looking at people who leave Christianity, it is doctrinal rigidity and saying this is exactly what you need to believe. If you do not believe this, you are, you are contravening the will of God, or you are against the church. And Anglicanism, because when you talked about the 39 articles, it does favor the Reformed side, but it is pretty broad, and the 39 articles aren't binding for laity. And so there is a fairly wide range of theological expression that you can have within Anglicanism without being against Anglicanism, or without having to tie yourself into knots to be like, well, I can accept this doctrine, but in a really specific way, or I have to sort of do backward handsprings. So in the episode I talked with Lisa Cooper about, in Lutheranism, a really big issue that causes a lot of cognitive dissonance within autistic Lutherans, especially confessional Lutherans, are issues around creation and evolution. And that's sort of a non-issue in Anglicanism, because that's not to say all Anglicanisms support theistic evolution or anything like that, but there are places within Anglican theology in which you can accept a theological perspective on evolution and fully accept it. And there aren't a lot of positions where you're sort of forced to hard commit to one thing, and the sort of breathing room that it gives you is often very, very helpful for autistic people, where dealing with issues, especially like scrupulosity and rumination, and a lot of these really common issues that autistic people face, the way that doctrine is thought about and talked about often is very helpful for autistic people who just have that space and that freedom to navigate inside, and that really helps a lot of them. And that is very commonly cited. Some autistic people have the exact opposite reaction to that. They go, the guardrails are off. I don't know what I'm supposed to do in this tradition. I hate that the guardrails are off. I need guardrails. Someone just explicate the doctrine for me. And those people tend to join Catholicism or a Calvinist tradition, like a Reformed Presbyterian or something like that, depending on which way those specific proclivities lie. But yeah, so it can be a double-edged sword, but the largest cutting edge is in favor of doctrinal flexibility, in that is very important. Another really big thing is autistic people tend to be internally syncretic in their Christian belief. That is the term I have decided to use to describe the fact that autistic people are sort of like theological magpies that fly around collecting shiny trinkets from other theological traditions and then incorporating them all into their own bespoke theology that is believed by one person ever in the history of Christianity. And Anglicanism is tolerant of that type of behavior, and there are ways that you can exist within Anglicanism while borrowing from other traditions, and and having those types of ways of thinking about things while still being in communion with your fellow Anglicans, and having guys who just have their own specific theories about how things are. Although the 39 articles do take a hard stance on the Council of Chalcedon, you are allowed to have complicated feelings about the Council of Chalcedon within
That's right.
Yeah, within Anglicanism, and which is, something that has come up so frequently that my podcast merch store has a sticker that says I have a somewhat complicated relationship with the Council of Chalcedon, because so many autistic people express those issues. The final one is LGBT inclusion or affirming theology or the possibility of affirming theology. So the largest contingent of Anglicans within the autism Anglican contingent are the inclusive Orthodox Anglicans, whether they
Mm-hmm.
know that's the term to use
Right.
to describe them or not. That is the largest contingent, where they are very interested in small o orthodoxy and the creeds and interested in those types of things. But also, they want to be affirming of same sex sexual relationships, women's ordination, and transgender inclusion within the church. Autistic people are disproportionately LGB and T. They are also disproportionately interested in issues of gender equality and things like that. If you go back to the episodes that I did about autistic attitudes on things like women's ordination and feminism and stuff like that, you will hear the term thrown around default meritocratic egalitarian, meaning autistic people as a default tend not to care too much about gender and gender segregation and have an attitude of if you're qualified and it makes sense, it's fine. And that attitude slots in very well with a lot of the social politics and theologies that exist within Anglicanism, where if you are Catholic, for example, but you want to be LGBT inclusive, you can sort of just pop over to Anglicanism and do
Right.
what you were doing there, but also now not worry about if your gay friend is going to hell or if you are going to hell for being gay or what have you. So those are the cited reasons for why Anglicanism is so appealing. And when you talk to them, they will mention probably one of those five things. The
Interesting.
the least there's another factor, which is just like geographic proximity, and especially in the UK, it's basically like, well, that was the church that was closest to me, so I just went there. Generally speaking, there's also Anglicanism is pretty accessible in that there are across the Anglosphere there are quite a few different Anglican churches, and it's regionally and locally accessible in the way that some denominations might not be. But yeah, so that's the last reason. But the big ones are doctrinal flexibility, the love of the Book of Common Prayer, the high church liturgy, the varied traditions within it that allow them to be internally syncretic, and then LGBT inclusion. So those are all the big ones. So finally, why do autistics not like Anglicanism, or why do they leave Anglicanism if they were in Anglicanism and they left it, or if they were considering Anglicanism and they thought, nope, not for me, don't want to do it anymore? If you had to guess what would be the cited reasons for it, what do you think you would find?
Yeah, I think my guess would be that it is the embrace in sort of some corners of the church of this very sort of metaphorical approach to the faith, this sort of the kind of theological liberalism that says, well, this is all just, a nice story, but none of it really happened historically.
Yes. So that is actually the number one cited reason for leaving Anglicanism for autistic Christians. It is the general sentiment is they felt the leadership in the church were not taking the gospel or Christianity very seriously, a sort of contra-spongism or
Mm-hmm.
something like that, where they're sort of like, well, if this is all a metaphor, what's the point? This has to be real, or there's no point in pretending it's real. I don't really want a Christianity themed Rotary Club. I want I want an actual like church that believes in the things that it says it's going to believe, and I don't see
Mm-hmm.
much of a point not being like that. And encounters with those types of churches make them go, maybe I should try out Catholicism, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe I should go to the Calvinists or something like that, or find a church they will typically say that's more serious about Christianity. And what
Yep.
they're typically expressing there is just a Christianity that actually believes Christian doctrine. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a big
Fair
thing that
enough.
gets cited. A
Yep.
lot of it there's also a lot of sort of I don't know what to call it, but Richard Rohr, probably a cool guy. I've never met him. I don't really know much about him. I haven't got a whole lot out of his books. He's Catholic, but beloved by certain people in the Anglican Church. And
Yes.
most of us are sort of in the you could not convince me to care what he says or the types of things that he says. It's cool that this exists, but this is certainly not for me. And there tends to be, especially in older clergy, a sort of unwarranted enthusiasm for those types of thinking that
That's right.
is not appreciated in autistic people. So it's not necessarily theological liberalism, but the way that spirituality is expressed is vague and mystical, and not mystical in the way that autistic people like it. Like, autistic people can get down with mystical theology if it's like they're far more in the Simone Weil, Teresa of Avila, the pseudo-Dionysus, that sort of version of mysticism than the
Yes.
yeah.
Yep. Less the sort of vague, airy, kind of fake Celtic have an
Yes.
experience with the tree sort of thing.
Yeah. And so finally, or not finally, so another factor that gets frequently mentioned is a frustration with the overemphasis of social justice at the expense of Christian teaching. I don't know how else to say it, but that is typically what they express.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of a sentiment like, I do actually want a church that believes in God, not a left-wing political movement. I am left-wing, but like, if I wanted a left-wing political movement, I'd join the DSA. I
Right.
actually want to go to church. Like,
Makes a
I'm
lot of
here
sense to me.
in
Yes.
the church trying to do church things. I'm down with all this stuff. You see a lot of autistics, especially a lot of, ironically enough, LGBT autistics complaining about pride flags in churches and things like
Mm.
that, and getting sort of frustrated with a lot of the perception is there's a lot of tokenization of political
Yep.
minorities and things like that in order to be like, look how cool we are, look how good we are, and a neglect of core Christian teaching. And they're like, look, I could get this anywhere. If I
Right.
wanted this, I could join the DSA, I could join the NDP, and I could get
Mm-hmm.
all of this fulfilled. I'm not coming to church for this. And there's sort of just like a frustration with that, and a desire for the church to be more focused on the church and on the gospel and on saving your soul rather than climate change. Not to say
Mm-hmm.
they don't think these issues are important, they do, but that perhaps the church has overestimated its role as a social political thought leader and neglected its role as a spiritual influence. So that gets cited quite a bit when you're talking about people who leave Anglicanism. Another big one is disagreement on LGBTQ plus issues. So,
Mm.
that one's pretty obvious. They start off affirming, and then as they become more Christian, they stop being as affirming, or they start to have questions about being affirming, and they're not always handled appropriately. It's like, what do you mean? Why are you asking? How dare you ask
Right.
this question? Instead
Totally.
of
Yep.
instead of a more pastoral concern. And a lot of autistic people don't always express their disagreements in ways that a lot of clergy are ready to have disagreements expressed to them.
Mm.
I'll
Mm-hmm.
say, we can be pretty straightforward and blunt in a way that many clergy are not quite prepared for. And
Mm.
whoa, you're bad and problematic and shouldn't be asking these questions, instead of being like, hey, have you read this book?
Right.
You might enjoy this book instead, which is the proper way to deal with these questions. Just give them
Yeah, that
something to
makes
read and think
sense.
about rather
Mm-hmm.
than that. So you have those types of concerns that often cause them to leave Anglicanism for a different branch. And then another factor that I've noticed is just becoming more socially and theologically conservative over time puts you out of step with the Anglican Church as
Yep.
it is. And then that sort of just has an effect on the way you perceive Anglicanism, and you sort of are kind of like, I'm looking for something else. Typically, those guys end up swimming the Tiber and
Sure.
converting to Catholicism,
Yep.
or in a minority of cases, they'll join a more theologically conservative reform movement. Sometimes they just join the ACNA as well,
Mm-hmm.
if that's available to them, but it really depends. Anyway, those are the reasons that they typically cite for leaving Anglicanism.
Interesting.
So that's all I had really planned to talk about this episode. Do you have any questions for me, or should we cap this off?
Nice. Yeah, I think some answers to this might already be sort of implied in what we've talked about. But if you are like me, an Anglican clergy person who wants to make his church, his congregation, as sort of comfortable and welcoming and helpful a place as possible for autistic Christians, are there particular things that you would recommend?
Yeah, so I mean, this will vary from place to place, right? So autism is a heterogeneous,
Mm-hmm.
complex neurodevelopmental disorder that has many different types of presentations. So unfortunately, there aren't many silver bullets or like one weird trick type of
Of
thing.
course, yeah, yeah.
There's lots of stuff you can do. The biggest thing that I always tell clergy is, first step, learn what autism is, like interact with autistic people. I know I don't have to tell you to do that because I see your Twitter mentions. You've got swarms of us in those. So you've already probably got a pretty good idea. But a lot of autistic or a lot of clergy don't really know what autism is and have misperceptions about it. There are lots of just basic things you can do. Don't rapidly change stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Take their questions seriously. So a lot of autistic people will badger you with questions, will ask you about things in a pretty direct way, and just
Mm-hmm.
taking that in stride and understanding that this is sort of just how they are, and it's okay that they're that way. Having like clear direct instructions on your website for what things are expected of you in
Mm.
church, that's often a really big barrier for autistic people. I want to go to church, but I don't know what I should expect at this church, and then
Yep.
wanting to sort of bridge that gap into getting in, they don't know how to do it, they don't know what to expect. And often I just recommend have something on your website that's like, this is what church is like here. Here is a
Yeah.
detailed explanation. You're going to walk in the door, someone's going to hand you a pamphlet. This pamphlet has all that you need to know for the service. It will have things that you say along or sing along with. There is another book that you have to read from for other things or whatever, just making sure those things are clear and what the expectations of the people are for the services. Stuff like that is really important. Another
Mm-hmm.
big one is just talking to the individual autistic person and just being open to providing reasonable accommodation where they need. Sometimes the requests just aren't going to be able to be granted because there are competing issues and competing needs, but just listening and making that good faith effort to try to hear them out and hear out what their issues
Mm-hmm.
are, I think is a really big one. But another, I think like a really important thing that I've talked about a few times here so far is be open to answering their questions. That is probably the
Mm.
biggest thing that autistic people
Mm-hmm.
struggle with, especially when they're new to Christianity. They have lots of questions, and sometimes clergy aren't super super down with that in a way that
Yeah.
they are going to be properly responding to for autistic people. Yeah, and just that type of thing. So
That makes
that's
sense.
generally what I would say. But overall, Anglicanism has in it a lot of technology that is
Yep.
already pre-built for helping autistic people and already has many of the right ingredients. They just need to sort of be mixed together at the right time for autistic people. I mean, I'm Anglican myself. I was not raised
Mm-hmm.
Anglican. I'm one of those convert statistics. But yeah, that's
Yep. A good argument among many for the Book of Common Prayer, eh?
yes, yes, yeah, yeah. Anything else?
I don't think so, no.
Cool. All right, we will sign off here. My name is John. You can find me on Twitter at ChristianityOn. You can find me on Blue Sky at ChristianityOn.bluesky.social. If you'd like to email me, you can email me ChristianityOnTheSpectrum@gmail.com. We have a merch store if you would like to purchase any associated merch that is associated with this podcast, like a sticker explaining that you have a complicated relationship with the Council of Chalcedon, or another sticker, or perhaps even a sweatshirt that express that you are religious, not spiritual. You can find those all on the merch store, which I will link in the description. Proceeds will be distributed to the artists and the Against Malaria Foundation. I would just like to personally thank everyone who has so far donated to the Against Malaria Foundation. We are over $740 Canadian, which is wild and awesome. I did not think we would get this much support for it, but I am overjoyed to see that, and it makes me really want to keep making episodes. If you would like to donate to the Against Malaria Foundation, I will leave a link in the comments that you can donate to. Would you like to sign off with anything?
Yep. Well, thanks for having me on. This was once again a really good time. If you're interested in reading any more of my work, the best way to reach me is probably my Substack, bencrosby.substack.com. And yep, that's it. Thank you. It was really a pleasure to be on.
All right, cool. See you.